I want to begin with a question that should trouble anyone who still believes the world operates according to the rules we were taught after the Cold War. What does it mean when the United States captures a sitting foreign president without declaring war, without invading a country, without firing a single shot? Because this is not merely a news event. It is a crisis, a turning point, and potentially a shift in the world order, one that has gone largely unnoticed beneath the language of legality and moral righteousness. I am not asking whether Nicolás Maduro is corrupt. That debate is beside the point. I am asking something far more unsettling. What kind of world are we entering when law itself becomes the preferred weapon of regime change? For decades, power was exercised openly through invasions, coups, sanctions, blockades. Those tools were blunt, visible, and costly. They provoked backlash. They exposed imperial ambition too clearly. But what if power no longer needs tanks or troops? What if it can be exercised quietly through jurisdiction, indictments, and carefully staged diplomatic encounters? That is what makes this moment dangerous. Because when a president is arrested, not after a revolution, not after a defeat, but during a supposed negotiation, when sovereignty dissolves the moment someone steps off a plane, we are no longer living in the world of traditional geopolitics. We are living in a world where law replaces war, where courts do what armies once did. And if that sounds cleaner, more civilized, even reassuring, then we are missing the point. This is not about Venezuela alone. It is about precedent. It is about power learning from its past mistakes. It is about a system that failed to break a government through sanctions, failed to starve it into submission, failed to replace it through opposition recognition, and then quietly change the rules. Ask yourself this: if a collapsed, sanctioned, internationally isolated country can still resist pressure, what does that say about the limits of American power? And if those limits are reached, what happens next? I would argue that what we are witnessing is not just this catching up with a dictator, but the evolution of empire from military dominance to juridical dominance, from bombs to subpoenas. And once that transformation occurs, the consequences are not confined to Caracas. They extend to every state, every leader, and every society that sits uncomfortably outside the orbit of U.S. interests. This is why Maduro's arrest is not the end of a story. It is the opening chapter of a far more consequential one. Before we move forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel. These geopolitical shifts are unfolding fast, and you won't want to miss the next update. The biggest mistake the public is making is to believe this story is about Nicolás Maduro. It isn't. Maduro is not the prize. He is the instrument. The real event, the one that changes the entire landscape, is that the United States has demonstrated a new, far more efficient method of exercising power. Regime change without invasion, coercion without occupation, control without formal responsibility. For decades, American power relied on visibility, troops on the ground, aircraft carriers offshore, shock and awe campaigns followed by nation-building projects that failed expensively and publicly. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, these were not just military disasters. They were political lessons. They taught Washington that brute force creates resistance faster than compliance. So power adapted. What we are witnessing in Venezuela is not a moral awakening or a delayed pursuit of justice. It is a strategic pivot. Instead of trying to bend an entire society through sanctions, a tool that punishes populations while hardening regimes, the United States went after the narrowest choke point possible, the individual who holds the system together. This is the key insight. The arrest of Maduro solves a problem that sanctions never could. Sanctions failed because Venezuela was already broken. You cannot economically strangle a country whose economy has already collapsed. You cannot isolate a regime that has found alternative patrons. China financed Venezuela. Russia militarized it. Oil revenues reduced but persistent kept the system alive. Traditional pressures simply ran out of leverage. But leadership continuity was the one thing sanctions could not touch until now. By removing the individual at the apex of the system, Washington didn't just remove a president. It collapsed the coordinating mechanism that kept Venezuela functioning as a unified state, however dysfunctional. The military, the bureaucracy, the energy sector, the foreign partners, all were linked through loyalty to a single figure. Remove that figure, and the system doesn't reform. It fractures. And fracture is opportunity. This is why the legal framing matters so much. By treating Maduro not as a head of state, but as the leader of a criminal enterprise, the United States bypassed sovereignty altogether. Law replaced diplomacy. Courts replaced negotiations. And because it is wrapped in legality, the move appears restraint, even ethical, but restraint is an illusion. This approach achieves what invasions once did. It creates a power vacuum without taking responsibility for what fills it. It allows Washington to influence outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability. If Venezuela stabilizes, credit goes to justice. If it collapses further, blame goes to internal dysfunction. That is the brilliance and the danger of this strategy, because once this model exists, it does not remain unique. It becomes portable. It can be applied to any leader who defies S strategic interests, operates within transnational financial or criminal systems, can be lured into a jurisdictional trap. This is not about Venezuela's past. It is about the future architecture of power. The landscape has changed, and the public debate focused on Maduro's guilt or innocence has missed the transformation entirely. To understand why this is happening now, why Venezuela, why Maduro, why this method, we have to step back from the drama of the arrest and look at the accumulated failures that made this moment inevitable. This crisis did not begin with Nicolás Maduro. It began long before him with Venezuela's unique position in the global political economy and the choices made when oil wealth met weak institutions. For most of the 20th century, Venezuela was not an enemy of the United States. It was a reliable oil supplier integrated into the Western system, governed imperfectly by elite PACs that traded political stability for access to energy rents. That model was corrupt, exclusionary, and brittle. But it worked as long as oil prices remained manageable and global power was uncontested. The rupture came with Hugo Chavez. Chavez did not invent Venezuela's problems, but he exploited them brilliantly, riding a wave of popular anger against inequality and elite capture. He redefined oil as a weapon of sovereignty. Nationalization was not just economic policy. It was a declaration that Venezuela would no longer subordinate its most valuable resource to foreign capital or Washington's preferences. For a time, this worked. High oil prices masked institutional decay. Social programs expanded. Political loyalty deepened. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was happening. The state was being hollowed out and replaced by personal loyalty networks. The national oil company PDVSA stopped functioning as a professional energy firm and became a political instrument. Expertise was purged. Revenue transparency vanished. Oil income no longer built capacity. It financed loyalty. When oil prices collapsed after 2014, the illusion shattered. At that point, Maduro inherited not a state, but a shell, and Washington made a critical miscalculation. It assumed economic collapse would produce political collapse. That assumption was wrong. Why? Because sanctions do not destroy regimes that destroy societies. When an economy collapses completely, normal political pressure disappears. Elections stop mattering. Public opinion loses leverage. Survival replaces reform. In that environment, regimes that control food, fuel, and force often become more resilient, not less. This is why sanctions failed in Venezuela the same way they failed in Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. They removed incentives for compromise and rewarded defiance. Meanwhile, the global system changed. After the Cold War, the United States operated under a simple assumption. There was no alternative system. But by the late 2000s, that assumption was no longer true. China began offering capital without political conditions. Russia offered security partnerships without moral lectures through mechanisms like China's Belt and Road Initiative. Venezuela gained access to financing that bypassed Western institutions entirely. Oil for loans deals replaced dollar markets. Sanctions lost their bite. At the same time, U.S. foreign policy remained stuck in an earlier era. still relying on economic punishment and diplomatic isolation to force compliance. When those tools failed, Washington escalated rhetorically but not strategically. By the time Maduro consolidated power, Venezuela was no longer a normal state. It had become a hybrid entity, part country, part patronage network, part geopolitical outpost for rival powers. That is the deeper reason this moment arrived. The arrest of Maduro is not a sudden act of justice. It is the end stage of a long process in which institutions were destroyed, sanctions hardened rather than weakened power. Global alternatives eroded U.S. leverage, and leadership became the final remaining pressure point. When systems collapse but leaders endure, power stops targeting structures and starts targeting people. That is why this is happening now. If we strip away ideology and rhetoric, what remains at numbers, and those numbers explain why Venezuela became unsustainable for Washington and why this moment arrived now. Start with economic collapse. Between 2013 and 2021, Venezuela's GDP contracted by roughly 75%. Few countries in modern history have experienced an economic implosion of that magnitude outside of wartime. This was not a recession. It was a systemic breakdown. By comparison, the U.S. Great Depression saw GDP fall by about 30%. Venezuela lost more than double that without the World War. Inflation tells an even starker story. In 2018, Venezuela entered full hyperinflation, with prices rising at an estimated 1,000% annually. The national currency became functionally worthless. Salaries lost meaning. Savings evaporated. Monetary policies ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The social consequences were immediate and measurable. By 2024, more than 7 million Venezuelans, roughly 1/4 of the population, had fled the country. This is the largest refugee crisis in the history of Latin America, surpassing Syria's displacement rate relative to population. Neighboring Colombia alone absorbed over 5 million migrants, placing enormous strain on infrastructure and social services. And yet, despite this collapse, the regime did not fall. Why? Because oil never went to zero. Before Hugo Chavez, Venezuela produced roughly 3 million barrels of oil per day. By 2020, production had collapsed to under 400,000 barrels per day. But by 2024, output had recovered to approximately 800,000 barrels per day. Still far below potential, but enough to generate cash flow at an average discounted price of $60 per barrel. That translates to nearly $17 billion per year in gross oil revenue. Not enough to rebuild the country, but enough to pay security forces, maintain elite loyalty, and survive sanctions. Trade data reinforces this point. By the mid-2002s, over 70% of Venezuela's oil exports were going to China, India, and other non-Western buyers, often through opaque intermediaries. China alone had extended more than $60 billion in loans since 2007 and repaid largely in oil. These were not aid packages. They were long-term energy contracts that insulated Caracas from Western pressure. Sanctions, meanwhile, produced diminishing returns. U.S. restrictions cut Venezuela off from dollar financing. But by 2019, over 90% of Venezuela's trade was already occurring outside U.S. and European financial systems. The sanction tool kept escalating, but its leverage was already exhausted. Now consider the military. Venezuela's armed forces number roughly 150,000 active personnel. But more important than size is control. Military-linked entities gained access to oil trading, mining, ports, and food imports. Estimates suggest that military-controlled businesses accounted for 20–30% of remaining hard currency flows by the early 2002s. This explains regime durability. Loyalty was monetized. Finally, public opinion polling inside Venezuela, where reliable surveys are difficult, still showed that 25–30% of the population continue to identify with Chavismo or oppose foreign intervention even amid economic ruin. That is not majority support, but it is more than enough to sustain polarization and prevent a clean political transition. Put these numbers together and a clear picture emerges. Venezuela was too collapsed to be sanctioned into submission, yet too functional to collapse on its own. It remained strategically valuable, geopolitically defiant, and structurally resistant to traditional pressure. In purely numerical terms, targeting the economy no longer made sense. Targeting the leadership did. What followed was not a sudden rupture, but a carefully staged escalation, one that unfolded quietly through signals, back channels, and calculated ambiguity. By late 2024, the situation inside Venezuela had reached the critical threshold. The economy was no longer collapsing. It had already collapsed. What mattered now was survival, and survival was becoming harder, even for those at the top. Oil revenues were insufficient to satisfy all factions. Smuggling networks competed. Sanctions relief dangled like oxygen just out of reach. And most importantly, the unity of the Venezuelan state, never strong, began to fracture at its most sensitive point, the military. Senior officers, long insulated by access to oil rents, gold mining, and import monopolies, started hedging. Intelligence reports suggested that key figures were quietly exploring exit options, not out of ideology, but prudence. When systems fail, elites look for lifeboats. Washington noticed this was the turning point. Instead of escalating sanctions or issuing louder condemnations, the United States changed tone. Messages shifted from pressure to possibility. Sanctions relief was discussed, not promised, but floated. Normalization was mentioned not publicly, but in whispers. The language of inevitability gave way to the language of transition. For Maduro, this presented a dilemma: remain defiant and preside over a slow, grinding disintegration, or explore a negotiated exit that could preserve personal safety and family security. History is full of leaders who believed they could trade power for immunity. Some succeeded, many did not. Maduro chose to explore the option. Envoys were sent, channels were opened, a meeting was proposed, carefully framed as exploratory, unofficial, and neutral. On paper, it was diplomacy. In reality, it was something far more dangerous, a jurisdictional trap disguised as negotiation. This is where power competition becomes visible. For Washington, the objective was clear: remove the keystone without toppling the arch in a way that forces direct responsibility. For Russia and China, the priority was delay. They issued warnings, raised legal objections, signaled displeasure, but they did not intervene decisively. Their leverage was economic and diplomatic, not operational. And then the moment arrived. The instant Maduro stepped into U.S. legal reach, the logic of the operation became irreversible. The arrest was swift, public, framed as law enforcement, not geopolitics. Charges were unsealed. The narrative was activated. In one move, Washington achieved what years of sanctions and diplomatic maneuvering could not. The Venezuelan state was decapitated without a single missile fired. The consequences were immediate. Within hours, uncertainty rippled through Caracas. Command chains froze. Civil servants waited for instructions that never came. Regional officials began making independent declarations. Opposition figures, long marginalized, returned to the public stage, calling for demonstrations, transitions, assemblies. The military, as always, held back. That silence was the most telling development of all. There were no tanks in the streets, no immediate declaration of loyalty, no coup yet, just recalculation. Officers assessed balance sheets, foreign accounts, sanctions lists. They asked not who was legitimate, but who could guarantee continuity. Meanwhile, Washington moved quickly but discreetly. Talks began with opposition leaders. Messages were sent to military intermediaries. The incentives were familiar: legitimacy, relief, access, recognition, not democracy as an abstraction, but survival as a transaction. Russia responded rhetorically, condemning the arrest as illegal. China called emergency consultations and emphasized sovereignty, but neither could change the facts on the ground. Their investments remained, their contracts endured, but their preferred interlocutor was gone. This was the climax, not the arrest itself, but the realization that the old equilibrium had collapsed. Venezuela was no longer a frozen conflict. It was an open contest, one in which law had triggered a geopolitical cascade. From that moment forward, every actor understood the same thing. the game had changed, and the next moves would decide not just who rules Venezuela, but who defines power in a world where war is no longer the first option, but never truly absent. The arrest of Venezuela's president is not an isolated event. It is a seismic shock that propagates outward in layers, each more unstable than the last. To understand the danger of this moment, we must examine its consequences at three levels: domestic, regional, and global. Inside Venezuela, the most immediate consequence is not liberation. It is disorientation. For years, the country functioned not as an institutional state, but as a personalized system. Authority flowed downward from a single figure who mediated between military elites, party loyalists, foreign patrons, and criminalized economic networks. Remove that figure, and what remains is not a vacuum. It is fragmentation. Civil institutions lack autonomy. Courts lack legitimacy. Ministries lack authority. The opposition lacks unity. And the population, exhausted, polarized, and traumatized, lacks trust. This creates a dangerous paradox. Maduro's removal increases the possibility of change, but decreases the capacity to manage it. Competing claims to legitimacy will multiply. Protests may erupt without leadership. Armed actors may step in temporarily. Transitional arrangements may exist on paper, but fail in practice. In such conditions, political conflict does not resolve, it metastasizes. Venezuela's crisis has never stayed within Venezuela. This escalation ensures it won't. Now, neighboring states are already strained. Colombia has absorbed millions of Venezuelan migrants. Brazil's northern regions face similar pressures. Caribbean nations lack the infrastructure to handle even modest refugee surges. If Venezuela descends into prolonged instability or worse, internal conflict, the scale of displacement could double or triple. Borders will harden, smuggling routes will expand. Armed groups, criminal networks, and traffickers will exploit chaos. History is unambiguous on this point. State collapse exports in security. Regional governments will face impossible trade-offs: humanitarian obligations versus domestic stability. Political polarization will intensify. Security forces will be stretched. And once instability crosses borders, it rarely retreats. This is how regional crises become permanent features of the landscape. The most dangerous consequences are global and structural. By removing a sitting head of state through legal maneuver rather than war, the United States has demonstrated a new model of coercion. It is efficient. It is deniable, and it bypasses the norms that governed international relations since World War II. This sets a precedent that others will study and adapt. If sovereignty can be overridden by jurisdiction, then diplomacy becomes conditional, travel becomes risky, and negotiations become traps. Trust erodes, leaders harden, compromise becomes dangerous. At the same time, energy markets will react. If Venezuela's oil sector is reoriented under U.S. influence, global supply dynamics shift, competitors lose leverage, aliens recalibrate, energy security becomes more explicitly politicized. This accelerates fragmentation, blocks harden, parallel systems expand, and the world moves further away from shared rules toward raw power, exercised quietly but relentlessly. The arrest of one man has destabilized the nation, strained the region, and altered the grammar of global power. That is the true consequence of this moment, and it is only beginning. When a state loses its center of gravity, the future does not unfold in a straight line. It branches. What happens next in Venezuela depends on bargains made in backrooms, on military calculations, on foreign powers deciding how far to push, and on whether exhausted citizens accept yet another transition designed somewhere else. Let me outline three plausible scenarios, each grounded in incentives and constraints rather than wishful thinking. In the best case, Venezuela moves toward a negotiated, internationally recognized transition that avoids large-scale violence. The military, still the decisive actor, accepts a civilian-led interim authority in exchange for guarantees, partial amnesties, protection of certain economic interests, and the phased easing of sanctions. Under this scenario, Washington lifts selected restrictions quickly enough to unlock investment, while regional governments and multilateral institutions coordinate humanitarian support. Oil output rises gradually as infrastructure is repaired and technical expertise returns. Political competition resumes imperfectly but within an agreed framework, and migration pressure begins to ease. Why this is plausible? Every major stakeholder has something to gain from order. Even rivals like China and Russia may prefer a predictable settlement that protects contracts over a chaotic collapse that endangers assets. The more probable path is messy, uneven, and drawn out. No immediate civil war, but no clean transition either. Competing factions inside the state military blocs, party networks, regional authorities, opposition coalitions jockey for position. Street mobilizations flare, then fade, then return. Government functions continue in some areas while breaking down in others. External powers play a quieter game. The U.S. pushes for a transitional arrangement friendly to its strategic and energy interests. China and Russia seek to preserve influence through financing contracts and relationships with key security actors. Sanctions relief comes in pieces, producing partial economic improvement that benefits certain elites first, risking public cynicism and renewed unrest. Why this is plausible? Fractured systems rarely reassemble quickly. When institutions are weak, politics becomes bargaining among power holders rather than a rules-based transfer of authority. In the worst case, the power vacuum turns combustible. The military splits. Armed groups expand. Competing claims to legitimacy trigger sustained unrest, and the state loses its monopoly on force. Oil facilities become contested assets, strategic infrastructure guarded by factions, sabotaged by rivals, or exploited by criminal networks. Mass displacement accelerates beyond the region's capacity, destabilizing borders and fueling organized crime. Foreign powers deepen involvement not necessarily with troops, but through money, intelligence, and proxies. Venezuela becomes an internationalized crisis, a Libya-like scenario, but with larger population pressures and far greater energy stakes. Why this is plausible? Polarized societies with weak institutions, abandoned weapons, and valuable resources are historically prone to conflict when central authority collapses. These scenarios are not predictions. They are strategic. Possibilities, each with its own internal logic, each shaped by the same reality. Once the old order breaks, the future becomes a contest over what replaces it. I want to end without answers because answers would imply control, and control is precisely what this moment calls into question. What has happened in Venezuela is often described as decisive, even elegant. No invasion, no bombs, no body bags on nightly news. Power exercised through law, timing, and leverage. On the surface, it looks like mastery, like the system finally learned from its past mistakes. But history rarely rewards that confidence. Structural change does not announce itself with clarity. It arrives disguised as efficiency, as innovation, as moral progress. Only later do we realize that the ground beneath us has shifted, and that the tools we thought we were wielding have begun to shape us in return. The arrest of a president did not resolve Venezuela's contradictions. It exposed them. It did not restore order. It removed the last mechanism holding this order together. And once that mechanism is gone, outcomes are no longer engineered. They emerge. This is the uncomfortable truth. Great powers prefer not to face. Influence is not the same as control. You can remove leaders, you can design incentives, you can manipulate jurisdictions, but you cannot command how societies reassemble after their center collapses. Nor can you contain the precedent you set. When law becomes a strategic weapon, trust erodes. Negotiation becomes riskier. Compromise becomes dangerous. Leaders travel less, talk less, and entrench more. Systems harden, blocks form, and uncertainty, already the defining feature of our era, deepens. For decades, Americans were told that power meant shaping outcomes, stabilizing regions, managing history. But we are now entering a world where power increasingly means choosing between unstable options, each with consequences beyond calculation. Venezuela sits at that crossroads, not as an exception, but as a signal that the old tools no longer work as they once did, a signal that new tools carry new risks, a signal that the line between order and disorder is thinner than we admit. What happens next will not be fully visible for years. And that may be the most honest conclusion of all. We are not watching the end of a crisis. We are watching the opening of a chapter whose meaning will only become clear when control on all sides finally runs out. If you found this analysis useful, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps sustain calm, evidence-based discussions about the structural forces shaping our world. Thank you for watching, and I invite you to continue with the next video where we examine how this turning point may quietly reshape global power in ways few are prepared to confront.